Your perception of everything around you may be more subjective than you think. The truth is that we can often experience things we know to be fact, like shapes and colors, very differently from the next person. But how? British neuroscientist Anil Seth says it's because your perception of the world is a construct of your own evolution. Seth's book, Being You, A New Science of Consciousness, is an exploration of how your unique view of the world comes to be. I'll ask Anil Seth just what is consciousness, and how are his findings helping us understand it better. This is the InnerView. Thanks for joining us here on the InnerView. Anil Seth joins us now, the author of Being You, A New Science of Consciousness, a neuroscientist and somebody who's truly fascinating. If you go down the rabbit hole on YouTube, you'll find very many interviews. So I'm going to try and make this one as different as I can. And I hope not to ask you, not to irritate you and ask you too many questions you've been asked before. But first of all, thanks for joining us on the InnerView, Anil.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure. Glad to be here.
So, we talk about a new science of consciousness. I guess the first question is, well, what was the old science of consciousness and how does the new science of consciousness relate to that old science?
It's a little arbitrary, I must admit. I mean, consciousness has been a topic of interest and inquiry across science and philosophy for hundreds, probably thousands of years, certainly since the beginning of neuroscience and psychology as academic disciplines, maybe about 100 or more years ago. But what's really happened in the last 30 years is that this scientific approach to understanding consciousness, understanding subjective experience, the redness of red, the feeling of pain or envy, or the taste of a good cup of coffee. I mean, this has really gained a lot of momentum. And my own take on it, and the reason we use the word, or I use the word, a new science of consciousness in the book, is it's really an approach to understanding consciousness as something that's really continuous with the rest of our biology. It's not a kind of software program that the brain runs and consciousness comes out somehow, but consciousness is kind of built into our basic biology in a very fundamental, very deep way. And I think this perspective can illuminate a lot of things about what it feels like to be me or be you, as the title of the book has it.
Yeah, you say it's not a kind of software, and something that's interesting. I remember the first time I came across the idea that for some people who suffer from severe forms of epilepsy, there was an experiment to actually sort of cut off the two hemispheres, right? So we think of like sometimes the brain as a computer, hardware, and consciousness being software, but there was proof there when they split the hemispheres and severed them off that a different kind of personality came out. Maybe not initially, but based on very specific tests afterwards, you saw people who seemed very different human beings to their friends and family and stuff. Talk a little bit about that, like the software, hardware aspect, and that physical changes to your brain can fundamentally create a very different level of consciousness emerging from the person.
One thing that I think everybody agrees about in the field, and people doing neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, all of these different approaches, is that our conscious experiences, and that includes your personality, what it feels like to be the person you are, is intimately dependent on the brain. You change the brain and your conscious experience changes. We know this from anesthesia. That's why anesthesia works. It turns people into objects and then back again into people. Consciousness is just turned off for a little period. We know it from people with brain damage who suffer different kinds of alterations in their conscious experiences. The late great neurologist Oliver Sacks wrote about this very beautifully. So we know there is this tight dependence on what the brain does and the brain's integrity and how our conscious experiences unfold. But this doesn't mean that the brain is a computer and that our experience is the kind of software or mindware that's running on the hardware or the wetware of the brain. People have always struggled with what's the right metaphor to help us understand this incredibly complex object that we each have inside our skulls. And the computer's a very powerful metaphor up to a point, because computers are very powerful. They can do many things, and our brains seem to be very powerful and do many things. But there are many differences between brains and computers. In a computer, you really do have this sharp distinction between the hardware, the chip inside your phone or your laptop, and the software that runs on it. I mean, that's why computers are so useful, because we can make them do whatever we want with different programs. But the brain isn't like that. There's no sharp distinction in the brain between the mindware and the wetware. Every time a single brain cell fires, the structure of the brain changes too. So it doesn't straightforwardly follow that consciousness is some kind of mind-implemented program. I don't think that's true at all. And what's fascinating, moving to this split brain procedure that you mentioned, this is fascinating. It's kind of hard to study now, because in medicine we have improved methods for treating people with epilepsy. So this operation that was done, maybe never that often, but was done more commonly a few decades ago, is not really done very much anymore. So we don't have that many people that we can still study. But there's a lot of historical interest in this, and there are still cases. And it is true that if you cut the brain in half, which sounds very, very dramatic, and it is, the first surprising thing is that actually people are fine. The epilepsy usually stops because you stopped the epileptic seizure from spreading across the whole brain. And it turns out that people seem pretty much unaffected until you start doing strange things and showing, for instance, one half of their brain one image and another half of their brain another image. And then you can sort of reveal this inner conflict where one half of the brain seems to be processing this information in one way and the other half in another way. There's even stories about the two halves of the brain disagreeing, and sort of one hand trying to stop what the other hand is doing. What do we learn from this? I think we learn that the idea that the self, this experience, this fundamental experience of being a person, this isn't a single indivisible essence that's independent of your brain and your body. I think we learn that what it is to be a self is something that the brain is always putting together. And if you intervene in the brain in a particularly dramatic way by cutting it in half, then the way the self is put together changes dramatically, so that if you look at it in some ways, you still have one self. But if you look at it in other ways, then you might have something like two selves.
Yeah, your brain's perpetually creating a story in the moment that you call the self. That's all wrapped into this one thought, ultimately, right? Your past, your present, your future, what you determine to be me. On the point of subjectivity, I want to look at some of the fun, quirky visual illusions. I'm not even sure if they're illusions, because they're just subjectively, the way people see things. Let's run through a few of these and talk a bit about it. And I don't want to belabor the point and stick on the visual part, because there's far more to it than just the visual. But let's first of all call up the desks. Now, you kindly sent this to us. These are the desks. Now, what I'm assuming with those two tables is that they're both the same length. Is that the issue there? But our brain doesn't suggest that.
I mean, I still can't believe it, right?
Yeah.
I've seen hundreds, probably thousands of times. I can't believe it. I'm tempted to get out a tape measure and check. But they're the same shapes.
Yeah.
And vision is very useful because it's so dramatic. But while we look at these, it's just helpful to bear in mind that what we understand here about visual experience, I think, applies to everything. It applies to what we hear, what we feel, what we touch, and it applies to the experience of self as well. Now, specifically what's going on here, this is called the Shepard illusion, after a psychologist called Roger Shepard. And what he did was was exploit something that the brain does that we don't generally know that it does, which is it compresses things along the line of sight. It uses things that come together in a distance as a cue for depth. So the table that's sort of straight onto us, that makes us perceive it as more compressed than it really is. So basically what's happening is that the brain has a lot of assumptions about how visual appearances change as things get further away. Because, there's this vanishing point in the... And it's that assumption that leads the brain to experience these two tables as different shapes, even though they're the same shape. And the thing is, even though we know that's going on, we can't help.
It's still hard to believe. And that's super interesting. Is this built in an evolutionary sense, or is it something based on what we've experienced as children, or is it something that's hardwired?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I must admit, I don't know the answer to that. With a lot of these illusions, it's usually a little bit of both. So the thing is, all of my life, but all of the lives of all of my ancestors have all experienced the same kind of environment where things further away look smaller. So there's been vanishing points of this form in our evolutionary history for millennia. So it's very, very likely that aspects of this effect are just baked into our visual cortex, baked in parts of the brain. Having said that, one of the remarkable things about the human brain, about most brains, is how flexible it is, how changeable it is, especially during childhood.
Right. And
so it's quite likely an effect of learning and development too. One of the things we're really interested in my group is how this effect differs. Is it stronger for some people, for other people? And to the extent that it differs between people, well, maybe there is an effect of learning during childhood. This is something we're really looking into.
Right. Let me call up a couple more. The next one is the two different circles. And let's have a look at this image because, okay, clearly, again, as much as I want to believe otherwise, I am reliably told that the circle on the left and the circle on the right are exactly the same size, the two orange circles. But my brain doesn't want to believe that. My heart doesn't want to believe that. So again, it's an element of perspective and a kind of priming that your brain is doing, right?
That's right. There are all these kinds of basic rules of perception that our brain uses to interpret what ultimately is quite ambiguous information that the eyes deliver. I mean, the eyes don't just reveal the world as it is. You just get electrical signals which are only indirectly related to what's out there. So the brain has all these tricks and shortcuts to try to reach a best guess about what might be going on. And one of the tricks, it's actually a different trick. So the first one was all about how things further away look smaller. Here, it's called a flanking effect. So the circle on the left that looked smaller was surrounded by bigger circles. And the circle on the right, surrounded by the smaller circles, looks bigger. And so this is the brain basically, in estimating how big an object is, it takes into account the context. So things surrounded by big things are more likely to be small than things surrounded by small things. And again, that's what we see, even though, we know it's different. Our brain is just whatever, this is what I've decided, this is what you're going to experience.
That's probably why leading men in Hollywood are always cast with shorter people around them, right? I mean, it's connected to that, right? It's psychological.
Tom Cruise problem.
Yeah. Okay, the final one, this one caused hot debate on Twitter about a decade ago, right? Now, I cannot see anything other than black and blue. And I mean, the way we've put it up there, I don't think we've altered it in any way in the context and whatever. Other people can only see gold and white or yellow and white. Even if I try to see white and gold, I cannot see gold and white. And it was an interesting metaphor because it sort of extended almost to political and religious debates, because you had that element of passion from people like, no, are you an idiot? Of course, it's only black and blue. So What is going on there with that whole color situation?
Okay, so firstly, I agree with you. To me, this looks blue and black.
And everyone else
And
is an idiot.
no, now you're getting to the political side of it. We're going to get there. We understand people who
Yeah.
see it the other way.
Right.
They're still wrong according to
Yeah.
us. But yes, I don't know. It depends exactly how it's on other people's screens.
Right.
But typically, about half the people in the world see that photo as gold and white, and half as blue and black. So what's going on here? Well, another thing the brain does when it's trying to make a guess about what color something is it again takes into account context. So color, the brain creates color from different mixtures of wavelengths of light. Now, color doesn't objectively exist out there in the world. It requires a brain to red things seem red because of the way the brain interprets particular mixtures of light coming into the brain. Now, if you've ever taken a piece of paper from indoors to the outside, it still looks white, if it's a white piece of paper. And this is quite remarkable if you think about it, because the actual light coming into your eyes from the paper has changed. The light inside is usually relatively yellowish. It certainly is where I'm sitting now in this room. But if you go outside, even on a cloudy day, the light is quite bluish. And so the light that the paper is reflecting changes because the ambient light is different, yet we still see it the same way. What the brain is doing is taking into account the ambient light, the context, in figuring out what color something is. And this is an incredibly important thing for the brain to do. Otherwise, all the objects around us would be changing color all of the time as the surrounding overall light change. And that wouldn't be much use for us, as creatures trying to use color to do useful things. Now, this particular image, it's a very ambiguous photo. It wasn't designed in a lab. It came out of nowhere, which is why it set the internet alight. And you can't really tell whether the ambient light is yellowish and inside or bluish and outside. And different people's brains, it turns out, in about 50-50 ratio, make different assumptions. So you and me, we tend to assume that the light is yellowish, and so we see the dress as being blue and black. The other people who see it as white and gold, their brains are making the assumption that the surrounding light is bluish, so they see it differently. Now, I found this absolutely fascinating because, and this turns to the more political point, what's really fascinating when this first hit the internet was not so much that people saw it differently, but they could not accept that somebody else could have a different experience. And actually, I think this has it's really got some deep social implications.
Right.
If we really understand, if we can really accept that, like, oh, hold on, my friend actually literally sees it differently.
Yeah.
That cultivates a little bit of humility about our own ways of seeing. And I like to think maybe this is a little bit optimistic, cultivates a little bit of humility about what we think and what we believe as well. So, it's a long shot, but maybe illusions like this can help provide some basic platform for recognizing the differences in how we see things, both literally and metaphorically, and help build some platforms for better communication and understanding. But I don't think this photo is going to save the world.
There are scientists and philosophers who sort of, I think of Bernardo Kastrup, who says, there's nothing objective out there. What we have, our senses are all dashboard, right? Ultimately, it's all dashboard in order to understand the universe. Donald Hoffman says that this is just a headset. So there's nothing objectively out there. Our senses are ultimately just headset for fitness, for survival, right? And of course, some people go super deep to the extent that they go that, space-time or all of reality is just an illusion. Where do you stand on this? I'm assuming you accept that there's no objective truth out there. We're seeing things through a personal lens. But how far do you go, Anil?
So I accept the second part of what you said there. So I totally accept, and I think my work is very much in line with this idea that what we experience even though it seems to be this direct window onto an objective reality, it is not. It is always a construction. It's a sort of neuronal fantasy, a brain-based best guess that's only indirectly related to what's actually out there. In the book, I use this term, a controlled hallucination. You know, and that means that it is something the brain makes up, but importantly, it's not anything goes. You know, it's very, very closely related to what's actually out there. And evolution has made very sure of this. You know, we see the world not as it is, but as evolution has decided it's useful for us to see it. So this means that, you know, from my perspective, yes, there is something objectively out there. You know, there is a real world, but we will never directly experience that real world.
Right.
It will all be hidden behind a kind of sensory veil. So, you know, Immanuel Kant, going way back, he talked about this in the idea of the noumenon, the nature of reality that we will never directly know. We can only kind of guess at, whether that's through the tools of science or through, you know, our own sensory and perceptual systems. I also resist a little bit this idea of the dashboard and the interface,
right,
and the headset. And the reason I resist that a little bit is because if you think that way, then you immediately think of the self as the sort of person behind the interface, the person
that's true.
It's the person viewing the world through the headset. From my perspective, and I think this is really the key point of what I write about, is the self is part of this process too. The self isn't the thing that does the perceiving through the headset or uses the interface. If there is an interface, the self is part of the interface, and there's no user. So I don't think it's a particularly useful metaphor. Both the self and the world, as they emerge in experience, are both kinds of constructions, both kinds of controlled hallucinations.
I'm reminded of that scene in one of the Superman movies where, you know, he's different and he absorbs everything more than what everybody else does. And I think he's in school and in the bathroom or something, and his mom comes and speaks to him through the door and tells him to sort of quieten it all down, right? And I sometimes imagine this idea that if we had everything cranked up, dialed up, we would go insane, right? If we were open to all perceptions, and that's one of the reasons why maybe you resist the idea of headset or dashboard, but one of the reasons why we need some sort of interface to kind of simplify things for us, because we'd go bananas if we were open to everything. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, everything is a lot. So it was directly sensitive to all forms of energy and out there in the universe. If we were equally sensitive to radio waves as to, you know, waves in the visible part of the spectrum, if we were sensitive to, I don't know, magnetic fields, and some animals are, you know, there are other creatures that have very different kinds of sensitivity to what's out there. So their worlds of experience, the German physiologist called this an Umwelt. You know, what is it like to be an elephant or a mosquito or a bat? You know, they have echolocation bats. So again, their inner world is going to be very different. So yeah, evolution for every creature, whether it's a human being or a field mouse, has made sure that we're sensitive to those parts of the environment that make a difference to our survival.
Right.
You know, in terms of what we can do. But it's not simply, color I think is a really interesting example. It's not simply that we experience just a subset of what's there. It's what we experience is both less than what's there and more than what's there. So, you know, colors, I have 3 different types of color sensitive cell in my eye. You have 2, but both of us see many more than 2 colors. You know, we see a range of colors. So in one sense, I experience less than what's there in reality because there's only 2 or 3 waves. But in another sense, more, because I experience, and you do too, hundreds, thousands, perhaps millions of different colors. I think that goes for everything. It's not just a subset, it's not just a filter. It's a construction that's based on a subset.
Right. So we're completely out of time, so I'm going to give you an option of one of 2 themes for your final question. You want to talk about AGI, and this would have to be brief. AGI or free will? Which one? You got to choose.
Okay, let's talk about AGI, because
Okay,
it's
so
more time.
AGI. So AGI. So what does AGI need to do in order to go from where it is to our level of consciousness, however you define it, Anil?
Intelligence and consciousness are different things. Intelligence is about doing the right thing at the right time, broadly. Consciousness is about subjective experience. The most basic experiences that we share with other animals are probably not things we associate with intelligence, but things like basic emotions, fear, pleasure, things like that. So I don't think that consciousness will just emerge as we get from the chatbot GPT-4 to GPT-5 or even GPT-10. But what will happen is that just like those illusions where even though we know the tables are the same length, we see them differently. Even though we know that the two circles are the same, we see them differently. It will be the same with AI. Even though we might know that they're not conscious, that they don't actually feel, we'll be unable to prevent ourselves feeling that they are. We'll project consciousness into these things because they play on our tendencies to project human qualities onto things that don't have them, and the way we privilege intelligence. So in a sense, we're going to have a problem in society, whatever the truth is about machine consciousness, because we'll experience these machines as being conscious, and that's we're not prepared for that. We really haven't dealt with that situation before.
I'm looking forward to reading what the comments section has to say about your take on AGI. It's always colorful. Anil, it's been fascinating. I thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.